Thank you, Wolfgang. And I know that a lot of what you tend to say is a lie. So certainly when you're introducing someone like me. But it is true that I have served in Afghanistan for a long time. Let me perhaps make one admission in terms of what is going to be the theme of my presentation, and that is that I do believe in elections. As a matter of fact, the inclusion in the Bonn Agreement of elections as it were the culmination of the Bonn process was my doing after a very heavy battle with my successor, with whom I cooperated for another 3 months. And I actually happen to strongly believe that elections are, while they are not equivalent to democracy, they are an important element towards building it and a condition sine qua non in terms of having some kind of representative government. It's also worth noting that in the Bonn Agreement, however, you don't have any reference to the UN supervising the elections in Afghanistan. That was because it was an amendment that I had to go to the Afghan delegation to ask for inclusion from the floor, and there was really no time then to finesse it into say that the election should be controlled or supervised or organized by the UN. Now, this is somewhat different in that sense from what happened in East Timor or Cambodia or Namibia, where the UN from the start was meant to run and control the electoral process. And this was also perhaps part of a deficiency that I still think we paid heavily for it, which was a decision that the international community, or at least the UN, should play a light footprint in Afghanistan at the time, December 2001, when I was convinced that the Afghan public would have welcomed a much heavier dose of international, I would almost say tutelage, in order to rebuild their institutions, not only ensure the non-return of the Taliban, but equally importantly, the disbandment of the militias led by the warlords that had ruined Afghanistan in the 1990s. Well, this, of course, did not happen. There's also, and I have a slight feeling that some people in the Obama administration seem to believe that the Bush administration was obsessively interested in spreading democracy around the world. I have to say that on the basis of my own experience in Afghanistan, I didn't perceive that at all. There was, of course, a great deal of interest in holding elections in the format of a democracy, but I never witnessed a particular interest in ensuring that the election should be free and fair. And I'm saying that because now there is this smell floating in the Washington, at least seen from Princeton, and there is this feeling that some people in the current administration believe that the US or the international community spread itself too widely, too thin, and that the focus should only be a very narrow security focus, namely the defeat of Al-Qaeda. Although I have to say that I don't know how are we going to be able to tell if Al-Qaeda has been defeated. We knew that we wouldn't know when the war on terror would end, but I'm not sure either that we know when the Al-Qaeda will be defeated. Is that simply the capture of bin Laden or of al-Zawahiri, or what does it really involve? Anyway, to go back to In the Bonn Agreement, there was a calendar of given dates when the various benchmarks ought to be complied. Now, calendars are useful, but they should never be seen as controlling the process. Calendars tend to be and should be seen as target dates, not necessarily as deadlines. Yet, the successor to Ambassador Finn was peculiarly interested in ensuring that elections would be held on time, regardless of whether the conditions were there to hold free and fair elections. In particular, there was enormous pressure to have the presidential election prior to the parliamentary election. True, it's easier to organize a presidential election than a parliamentary one. The result has been that we have a completely messed up constitutional calendar in Afghanistan, in which presidential elections are to be held 1 year prior to the parliamentary elections, with the consequent financial expenditure that this implies. For example, the presidential election now, the forthcoming presidential election, it will probably cost about $220 million. You will now have to double that for the parliamentary election a year from now, a year afterwards. And of course, I'll come to that as to whether these elections can be held. The last presidential election, in fact, the first presidential elections in Afghanistan took place in late September 2004, and the role of the UN, though much less strong than in the cases of Cambodia, East Timor, or Namibia, nonetheless, the role of the UN was significant. And I think that although the losing candidates, at least at the beginning, tried foul at the results, it was not very difficult to persuade them that, in fact, President Karzai had actually won free and fairly an absolute majority of the votes. He obtained 54%. Now, the involvement of the UN decreased by the time the parliamentary elections were held. It was still, we were still always with the issue. I mean, there is always, there were two slogans, in fact, used from Bonn onwards, from the Bonn Agreement onwards. And one was the light footprint, and the other one was Afghan-led. Now, Afghan-led, it's of course difficult to question. The point was always who amongst the Afghans was leading. Were they the legitimately elected representatives of the Afghan people, or were they self-appointed warlords and commanders who had a lot of the guns? So, in the same way, when it came to the parliamentary elections in 2005, in the fall of 2005, the parliamentary elections were held, and these elections failed the test of being completely above board. First of all, the vetting system that was envisaged failed. In other words, there was not, it became virtually impossible to win out from the, as possible candidates, candidates linked or leading illegal armed groups. And that happened mainly because ISAF, the US-led Enduring Freedom Coalition, and even some other Western countries showed no disposition to provide security in case rejected candidates caused security problems. As a result of this, many warlords and commanders managed to get elected to parliament. In addition, all kinds of other irregularities prevailed, particularly in areas geographically remote from Kabul, with many indigenous polling staff being linked to specific candidates. There was also dubious counting procedures, and in some provinces, such as Paktika, there was a great deal of ballot stuffing. In fact, if you look at the results of the parliamentary elections, you will find that in the more conservative Pashtun provinces, the largest number of female voters supposedly turned out. In the case, for instance, of Paktika, 100% of the women were supposed to have voted. Now, these parliamentary elections, where where only 50% of voters actually voted, in my view, marked the beginning of the loss of faith in the political process on the part of the Afghans, and marks the start of a growing cynicism towards the new, as it were, the new system in Afghanistan. Now, at the same time, let me say that continued international apathy towards either the DDR process, the disarmament process, and subsequently to the process of disbandment of illegal armed groups, have meant that no serious effort has been made to give the Karzai government the monopoly of the means of violence, with all the negative consequences that this entails in terms of insecurity, bad governance, corruption, impunity, or the spread of narcotics. Not to mention the failure to present the people of Afghanistan with a more appetizing model than the one prevailing under the Taliban. I think this is, I think that if we are looking at ensuring security in Afghanistan, it is not only a question of using military means, it is also a question of addressing the reasons why many Afghans are almost apathetic between the Taliban and the government-led forces or certainly international forces. Now, the Constitution, this Constitution here is a child of the light footprint. It is not a good Constitution, contrary to what many people will tell you. It is a Constitution drafted mainly by non-lawyers. It contains several contradictory passages and a great deal of lacunae. You may have read in the newspapers last week that there was a great deal of applause, or at least everyone took note, that for the first time the President of the United States, in referring to Iran, referred to it as the Islamic Republic of Iran, as it were, signifying that it meant for the first time the acknowledgement that Iran was an Islamic Republic. In the meantime, the West paid for and sat idly by while an Islamic Republic was being constituted in Afghanistan. In my contacts with a great deal of Afghans, I felt I never met anyone who was particularly keen to have an Islamic Republic established. They had gone through the period of an Islamic state under the warlords. They had gone through a period of an Islamic emirate under the Taliban. And many, certainly educated Afghans, wished to see some kind of separation between Islam and the state. Nonetheless, we went along with it. We went along also with, and by the way, this was not like Iraq, where the voters elected the Constituent Assembly, which then elaborated the Constitution. This was the Constitution was written by a commission appointed by Karzai under heavy influence from Islamist elements which had a lot of guns. Now, amongst why do I mention the Constitution? I mention the Constitution because, from what I will say a bit later, first of all, contrary to what we were hoping, the Constitution does not have a constitutional court. And at the same time, it does not give to the Supreme Court the same powers that might be held by a constitutional court. Let me just read you the relevant paragraph of the Afghan Constitution regarding the powers of the Supreme Court. It's in Article 121. And it says, at the request of the government, it's not even at the request of Parliament, at the request of the government, the Supreme Court shall review the laws, legislative decrees, international treaties for their compliance with the Constitution and their interpretation according to law. Now, that does not, in my view, grant the Supreme Court the power to interpret the Constitution, and certainly many people in Parliament refuse to accept that this is the right of the Supreme Court. Because there is also a second article in the Constitution, Article 157, that provides for an independent commission for the supervision of the implementation of the Constitution in accordance with the provisions of the law. I'm sorry, it's pretty unfortunate translation. Now, members of this commission shall be appointed by the President with the endorsement of the Wales-Girden. Now, this independent commission does not exist because the President has refused to establish it despite entreaties from many people in the Parliament. Now, let me turn now to the Independent Electoral Commission. This is the body that will run the elections in the month of August. Now, both the chairman of the Electoral Commission and the members of the Electoral Commission have been appointed by the President with no formal consultation, let alone approval, by either Parliament or by the other major political forces in the country. Now, under the Constitution, the term of office of the President concludes on the 22nd of May. Elections are scheduled to be held on the 20th of August. There is every likelihood of a second round if no candidate gets an absolute majority of the votes in the first round. Given the fact that last time it took about a month for the official results to come out, it means that you will not have the results until late September. It will then take another month to organize the new round, and this means that until the end of October, at best, you will not know who is the new president of Afghanistan. Now, the Supreme Court, Mr. Karzai played a very clever hand about 3 weeks ago. He announced that he wanted the election to be held before the 22nd of May, because so that there would be no uncertainty as to whether he was staying on beyond his prescribed mandate. I said it was a clever hand because he was going to win either way. If the Electoral Commission, the supposedly independent Electoral Commission, were to agree with him that the election should be held before the 22nd of May, then there would be no time for his opponents to organize themselves, and there would be no time for the Obama administration to perhaps pick up someone else or to back someone else. On the other hand, if the Commission rejected his proposal of having the elections before the 22nd of May, he would also win, because he would stay on as president, and the election commission would have contradicted his desires, thus proving its independence. As it turned out, the commission decided that elections should be held in August because, rightly, there was no time for to hold them any earlier. Now, following this, the president asked an opinion from the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that he would stay as president until a new president was elected. Now, I have to say that the Supreme Court, not only because of its lack of attributions, but also because it, for a number of other reasons, is not perceived as a neutral body in Afghanistan. And therefore it lacks the credibility, sufficient credibility for Afghans to accept this outcome. Now, there are, in my view, then, now, I must say I was a little taken aback, and I suspect many Afghans must have been taken aback about with the rush with which the State Department immediately endorsed the opinion of the Supreme Court and said they would be very happy if President Karzai remained in office until the elections. I'm saying I'm a little bit surprised because Afghans. I mean, the Afghans are somewhat contradictory people. On the one side, they don't like foreigners to tell them what to do, and that's not unique. There are plenty of other people who don't want foreigners to tell them what to do. At the same time, they have a fatalistic view that the next president of Afghanistan will be selected by the United States. And that they will be powerless to change this decision through the vote. So the endorsement by the State Department of the Supreme Court's decision, I'm convinced, has already been seen by many Afghans as a signal of continued support for Karzai's election. Even if it may well be that there are people in the current administration in Washington who would prefer either to back someone else or to do, as President Obama has said, back no candidate and allow the Afghans to decide by themselves whom they should back. But now we come to the issue of whether elections are actually possible in the month of August, in late August. I think they are scheduled for the 20th of August. And is it going to be possible in the current with the current security situation to hold elections that have credibility with the Afghan public or even with members of the international community? Now, bear in mind that half the Pashtun districts, or a quarter of the districts in Afghanistan, are now so insecure that no one dares. I mean, neither the civil servants nor foreigners rarely go there, and if they do, they go in very secure. I mean, with enormous amount of security support. Now, is it going to be possible to hold elections in those circumstances? There are basically two options. One option, assuming that one goes ahead with the elections, one is to delay the elections in those districts which are insecure, and this would mean disfranchising half of the Pashtun voters. This would be totally unacceptable to the Pashtuns, totally unacceptable to President Karzai or to any other Pashtun candidate for the elections. The second possibility, which I think is somewhat more likely, is that you hold elections everywhere, but in these insecure Pashtun districts, you basically you are only able to hold them in the district capital with some international military presence, perhaps, but certainly no international observers, or for that matter, even many Afghan observers. in the second scenario, the losers will inevitably cry foul. They will say that the elections have been stolen, and the outcome will be a delegitimized government in Afghanistan with all that entails at this point in time, and also it will probably, and of course it will be a tremendous gift to the Taliban. Now, there is a way out. This is why I mentioned that it was a challenge. It was an opportunity. There is a way out. In my view, the UN, assuming that the US has no problem with the UN playing such a role, because the role of the UN is increasingly diminished, the UN, in my view, or the UN Special Representative, should embark in the next 4 weeks in an active good offices role with the President, political parties or groupings, and members of Parliament to lay the groundwork for a roundtable conference that could be held in early May to decide on the following. One, whether President Karzai should remain in office beyond the 22nd of May. B, if he does stay, with what powers. 3, the adoption of measures to provide a level playing field and a code of conduct during the entire electoral process. D, the establishment of a council or commission composed of some Afghans of various political persuasions, possibly selected by the Secretary General's Special Representative after consultation with the main groupings, plus some 5 or 6 representatives of the key members of the international community, namely certainly UNAMA, the US, the EU, NATO, and perhaps a couple of other donors. And their task would be to ensure implementation of the measures agreed upon and in compliance with the code of conduct that the parties would have signed. And finally, in my view, such a gathering, such a roundtable, could also discuss a plan B in case credible elections could not be held or had to be postponed, and an emergency lawyer jirga had to be convened. You can't convene emergency lawyer jirgas in Afghanistan, or lawyer jirgas in general, which normally are meetings of almost 1,000 people, unless they are carefully prepared and the outcome is almost known before the meeting is convened. I think this roundtable could also do 2 other things. Start preparing for a new round of such discussions to provide an opportunity to review the Constitution, in particular towards a more parliamentary form of government, and also to agree on a consensual framework for talks with the Taliban. I have to say that for the past year and a half, there's been nothing but talk about talking to the Taliban. I have to say this is a novel method of diplomacy, in my view. I know of many cases of secret diplomacy, which has been publicly denied, in which you secretly talk to your adversary. In this case, the situation is the opposite. There are no real talks with the Taliban, but everyone is talking about its desirability, thus first confusing the Afghan public as to whether they are going to be eventually ruled by the Taliban, and also sending a message to the Taliban that everyone is desperately keen to talk to them. Now, am I optimistic that this idea that I have enunciated now will happen? Wolfgang, you're right. I very much doubt it. Governments normally react when it's too late, and when it's probably too late to certainly undertake the kind of effort that would be required to prevent the situation in Afghanistan deteriorating beyond what already is a very difficult situation. needless to say, the outcome of a bad election would mean an intensification of ethnic animosities. It would mean further discouragement of the Afghan public, and also discouragement, at least of the European public, who would feel that there was little point in continuing a military effort or even the kind of financial assistance, given the kind of government that would emerge at the end of this process. Thank you. Robert.
Two things. Thank you. It's always good to hear you, which you make us think. One comment on the setting up of Afghanistan as an Islamic Republic. What you didn't state is that, but implied, is that Karzai is in fact largely responsible for that by picking members of the commission and by pushing things in that direction. And you're quite right, it was not necessary, but something that he certainly said to me had to happen. It didn't have to happen. And all kinds of things proceeded from that, and I don't have to tell you about things in the Constitution
and you know how
included there.
The kind of commission that he established.
Well, exactly.
Constitutional commission.
It was, just as sort of a sidebar comment, Karzai has done lots of things that are illegal or quasi-legal, such as not setting up this commission that he was constitutionally directed to do, and earlier completely just ignoring the Chief Justice when it suited his purposes. And no one's ever dealt with that. They comment about the other sides of what he's done, is tolerance of corruption and the failure to go after various warlords and things like this, but they don't talk about his own sort of playing very light with the legal responsibilities of his office. But more importantly, the commission you're setting up, as you expressed it, didn't seem to have any kind of mandate from the Afghans. You talked of a group of Afghans that would be picked by the UNSC to sit on this commission, and UNAMA, NATO, and the EU, therefore not, as you sketch it, principal nation donors, i.e. the United States.
I also mentioned the U.S.
Sorry, I didn't hear you say that. Okay, but anyhow, this seems to me like a sort of high commission of outsiders to determine the fate of Afghanistan, and who is to obtain the assent of the Afghan people to what you're talking about, which is basically an essential change in the whole course of what's going on there. And you talk about the implementation, but they can't implement the policies they already have. How are they going to implement things like this that many people would object to?
Well, I think, one possibility is, of course, for the round table themselves to elect, let's say, 5 Afghans amongst themselves who would sit in this commission. The reason why I mentioned the appointment by this RSG, apart from being an incorrigible interferer in the internal affairs of other countries, apart from that, is that I think it will be difficult for amongst the Afghans to reach a consensus to who should sit, and that perhaps the Secretary General, the envoy, could, after, of course, close consultation, appoint them. But I am completely open to the idea that it should be, but I think there should be some foreigners, and I think the Afghans would welcome the fact that there were some foreigners who would be sitting in the commission to ensure that whatever is agreed is implemented.
Good luck. You said that it was to be sort of an international commission with some Afghans rather than the other way around.
Well, it could be presented.
In any event, my basic question is, who gets to see whether the Afghan people will go along with this? I mean, how do you get to the point where they say yes?
Well, how do we know that they accept the Independent Electoral Commission?
You're not saying turn it, close it down.
No, but I mean, if you hear Parliament, the Parliament claims that they should have been consulted and approved the appointment of each of the members.
Yes, and you've already told us who's in the Parliament.
So, maybe what I'm quite clear is that there needs to be a consensus amongst the key candidates, or potential candidates, not key candidates, the potential candidates, as to how to proceed, or the elections will not be, the result of the elections, you can have a number of serious candidates deciding to stay out, an election in which only Karzai would be the only credible candidate with about a few completely hopeless candidates, with a high level of abstentionism, plus the allegations of corruption and vote buying and fraud.
How important do you think is the success of the military mission of the military process, the NATO-led military process, and the surge and so on? How important is that to the political process? Or do you feel that the two are independent processes?
No, they are not independent, of course, from each other. They are closely connected. But I very much doubt that in sending, let's say, 20,000, I'll go as far, I mean, probably it will be less than 20,000. But let us assume that between the US and the Europeans, 20,000 forces are deployed during the electoral process. I don't believe that this will be enough to guarantee a free vote. Certainly it will not be enough to guarantee campaigning. Who is going to protect the various candidates? Will there be, who is going to ensure that the governors of each of the provinces do not do everything in their power to support, let's say, the incumbent president? There are a huge number of issues which no military search will address. And so I think that would be the main answer.
How do you want to square your suggestion about the round table with the feeling one receives from dealing with Afghans, that the readiness to have international forces and international activity and international presence involved in shaping the future of the country is diminished, if not getting to the point where it's turning into hostility?
I mean, I think that until the last month, and certainly while I was in Afghanistan, my last year in Afghanistan, I never heard one Afghan, from the president down, asking for more international military forces. I think that the country has reached a point after, yes, I was in favor, and I believe the Afghans did welcome international military forces at the end of 2001. I think that they are growing increasingly exasperated by their presence, increasing the number, which inevitably will lead to greater civilian casualties, will only increase the despondency or the anger of the Afghans. Now, it's true that since President Obama announced, or since it was clear that the US was going to send more forces, the Afghans, or rather leading Afghans, those who hope to run for president, have rushed to say that that's all fine and a very good idea, because they don't want to be seen to be on the wrong side of the administration. Again, believing that their chances would be nil unless the US was either supporting them or at least being neutral towards them. But I personally think that this is a narrow approach to security. Maybe one may need some more, but I think there are other ways of ensuring greater security, and the greater security can be achieved by ensuring far better governance, particularly at the provincial and local level, by doing something really meaningful to fight against corruption, like dismissing any leading person in the country that is believed to be linked to narcotics. It can be done by improving the rule of law and it can be done by offering far more jobs, more jobs to the Afghans, and delivering the kind of reconstruction assistance that the Afghans yearn for. That is one sure way of it's a sure way of winning the Afghan public in favor of the government and away from the Taliban, far more than through by sending additional military forces.
Master, you mentioned the inadequacy of President Obama's definition of the objective of Afghanistan as simply preventing an al-Qaeda or Taliban resurgence or defeating them, in many words. So according to you, at the same time, it seems important to have a vision of what the ultimate end goal in Afghanistan may be and what that perpetual exit strategy might be. So in your view, what would be the parameters of a successful Afghanistan wherein, would consider goal achieved?
Well, I think I have no problem with saying that the main objective is to prevent Al-Qaeda from being able to use the territory of a state or part of the territory of a state to carry out its aggressive or its terrorist activities. But it's also a matter of how do you achieve that. And I don't think you achieve that simply by military means, but you have to do it through a variety of other ways, including, of course, training more Afghan forces. But I noticed, for example, and I personally am delighted, that the number that President Obama has mentioned that the Afghan army should now have 127,000 soldiers, a maximum, and that the ceiling for the police should be about 90,000. There were people in Washington who were calling for an army of 400 security forces, army and police combined, of 400,000. Not only is this unsustainable in terms of the amount of money that would never be possible for any Afghan government to pay for such an army and police, it also completely is in total imbalance. You are focusing only on the security forces, but you're not focusing at the same time in building other civilian institutions like the judiciary, the civil service, political parties, and so on. And that would lay the groundwork for an eventual military regime in Afghanistan.
Mr. Ambassador, it could be argued that the U.S. public is probably not all that far from concluding that the situation in Afghanistan is basically hopeless, based on the Soviet Union's experience and based on the poppy prevalence that apparently nothing be done about it. What could happen in the next year, do you think, that might convince the American public that there's progress being made?
Well, curiously enough, I think that the same things that will change the view of the Afghans about how things are moving in Afghanistan, the same things would also satisfy the international public. In other words, if the Americans or the Europeans felt that, yes, we are spending lives and money, but there is now an improvement in governance, we have made progress in reducing corruption, there is now a far better government system at the local and provincial level. I think this would encourage both the Afghans to accept the continued international presence, and it would encourage our publics in feeling that we are doing something that is worth doing. We've never tried since 2002 to use the Afghan public as our ally. And the greatest and the objectives we have been pursuing in Afghanistan have not been objectives imposed by foreigners. There have been objectives that the Afghans themselves demanded and that coincided with our own.
But that, of course, would mean that when it's ready to go more into the state-building process.
It means that...
And it means also, because when you said before that to change and to rectify and to establish well-functioning institutions or the judiciary or the internal structure of the country, of course, it's very clear to train and equip 134,000 military men or women, in this case only men, is much easier than to change and to transform the political culture. And one could arguably bring further the question, which we heard before, by saying that one of the reasons why these objectives have been set is to also slowly prepare for a possible exit strategy. So there is a contradiction in this situation.
You mean
between what you can really, and I loved your term, making the Afghans to allies, but the contradiction really is how much can you do within a certain time frame?
I think that the international military presence in terms of combat forces cannot be spread for much longer. I think neither the Western public, or at least the European public, let alone the Afghan public, will tolerate it. On the other hand, I think our presence in terms of trainers and in terms of building civilian institutions can extend itself for much, much longer. And I think that the Afghans would probably continue to welcome it for as long as this is not seen as an overbearing presence.
What you're kind of pointing out is between what he's saying and what the new policy is, which is a policy that's heavily influenced by militaristic thinking. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but they're dealing with the problem as a military problem towards perhaps an eventual departure. You can look at Iraq as a model. You can look at Vietnam as a model. And they're not dealing with these other aspects. I agree with you very much, Francesc, that these other things have to be done. And until they're not done, the rest of it is never going to be successful, because you will have left, if you succeed in getting to a plateau where you can say we've accomplished a military goal, you've left a society that with all of the inherent problems that created the situation in the first place. So you're just back to zero. You haven't solved anything.
But of course, that stretches the
I
time frame.
think it's very interesting in terms of to look at the report that came out today or yesterday by the Asia Society on Afghanistan, which was a report written under the aegis at the beginning of Richard Holbrooke, and that contains quite a number. One of the key authors is one of the advisors of Holbrooke, and comparing that with the white paper that Washington published, and you will see, you can tell that the influence of the military, of the U.S. military, has been much greater. I mean, the differences between what the report of the Asia Society says and what the Obama plan is, it's largely in function of much more military elements, or the omissions. For example, there are two recommendations from the Asia Society that I have been asking for a year and a half. One is the closure of Bagram, of the Bagram detention center, which is worse in many ways than Guantanamo, and secondly, the signature of a SOFA, of a status of forces agreement between the U.S. and Afghanistan regarding, to regulate the activities of the international forces. Now, those two elements are very much present in the report of the Asia Society, and they are absent from the white paper. Oh, sorry.
Ambassador, you gently mocked the approach taken with the talk about speaking with the Taliban as being backwards and not following normal diplomatic protocol. But other observers also say the talk is absurd to begin with because the idea of a moderate element in the Taliban is a myth. What is your view? Is there a future for Taliban in Afghanistan? Is there a future role or elements thereof?
Well, this is why it wasn't so much that talking in public, repeating constantly that one should talk to the Taliban breaks diplomatic protocol. It doesn't break diplomatic protocol. It simply undermines what you're trying to do. But I think I would be cautious. A lot of us seem to believe, but we're not sure, that there are a good number of people who have joined the insurgency, not because they wanted to establish an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, but rather because of localized grievances, lack of jobs, land issues that have gone unaddressed for years, lack of any system of justice, maybe eradication of narcotics, etc. And I think it's worth exploring, quietly, it's worth exploring whether some of these commanders could not be won over to the government side if some of the, by first guaranteeing their security if they cross over, and two, by addressing the grievances that led them to take up arms in the first place. Now, can this work? Will that lead to significant number of commanders from crossing over? I don't know. We have to try, but I'll give you an example. I've met several times with two Taliban, former Taliban in a way, who are in Kabul and whom I had met when I was the UN envoy. One is the former foreign minister, Mutawakil. The other one is the former ambassador, Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, who eventually went on a Caribbean holiday to Cuba. Now, Mutawakil, whom I've known very well, I got to know very well when he was foreign minister, said to me, yes, you can divide the Taliban. You can have them, you can deal with the moderates, you can split them from the hardliners, let's say from what is known as the Quetta Shura. I then went to see Mullah Zaif, that's the former ambassador to Pakistan, and he said absolutely the opposite. You cannot, you will never get significant Taliban crossing over unless you involve Mullah Omar. Now, I have to say that from my own experience, when I was the UN envoy, I obviously was trying to see, in those days, if one could detach the more moderate people that one perceived as being Taliban nationalists, Afghan nationalists, and from the Taliban that were, let's say, ideologically driven. It's not only that I failed, you can say, well, Vendrell failed, so what? The most significant thing is that after September 11th, it was absolutely obvious that the US was going to bomb the Taliban out of existence, and despite that, the Taliban stuck together until they were driven out. There was no split. So I also know from other civil conflict situations that it is often said that the commanders who live, the top commanders who often live in exile or abroad, do not control their forces. But in fact, in every case where I've been involved, be it Salvador, Guatemala, or East Timor, they did control the forces. So I don't know. The answer is we can only try. It's all very well. Some people say, well, all we want from the Taliban is that they cut their links to Al-Qaeda. But the answer is, of course, how are we going to verify that they have cut their links? Just saying that or promising that in a piece of paper isn't enough. And now it's much easier to verify the Taliban demand for the withdrawal of international forces, for example, but it's much more difficult to verify the cutting of links with Al-Qaeda. And anyway, how do we define Al-Qaeda? Which is, in my view, another point. I mean, are the Pakistani Taliban, people like Masood, are they probably, they may be allied to Al-Qaeda, but they are probably not Al-Qaeda. Are they fine from now on? Should one reach the kind of agreements with the Taliban that we are condemning the Pakistani government for reaching with their own militants?
Well, I was, as you know, I was ambassador in Tajikistan from 1998 to 2001. And I arrived there just as they were at the end of their civil war with a UN-brokered ceasefire. And the reason that the Tajiks agreed to it was because they were afraid that they were turning into Afghanistan. They had basically three major parties. There were two communist inherited groups, one from the Uzbek north, another from the Tajik south, and then there was a rainbow coalition of people, including people like you and me, and people from the eastern part who were different ethnic groups, and also the Islamic Party, which was the face of that group. And they finally arrived at a solution where the opposition was supposed to get 30% of seats in the government. You know this, of course, they're in the major positions and in the parliament, et cetera, and the bureaucracy. And that never really happened. They got some seats. And they managed to stop their war. Not that it ended. When I was there were still bandit groups outside town, including one by a man named Hitler, run by a man named Hitler, who finally got killed along with lots of his friends. And about a year later, they discovered in the mountains that there were large hundreds numbers of Uzbek fighters who had been part of the Tajik forces, and they were threatened into leaving Tajikistan, and actually transported by the Russians, but most people don't know that. And the fighters came to Afghanistan, and the families went to Uzbekistan, where they were presumably made into soap by the government. And then it happened again the next year. But they were able to manage in a very bumpy and still not totally safe way to extract themselves from a situation not unlike Afghanistan. So I would never say it can't be done, because they did it, and the numbers of fighters there, you'd have to do a comparison. I don't know how many Taliban are, but I don't think the numbers are of a sufficient magnitude to say, well, Afghanistan is of such a different order that we can't hope that this could happen. I think it could happen, and in fact it didn't happen with a lot of money or input by the international community.
Yeah, I know.
So, maybe it would work out.
Except that I understand the situation in Tajikistan now is extremely fragile.
It's not paradise,
right.
No. I'll just tell you an anecdote. After this happened, we were at they had the first Buzkachi match, which is kind of their polo, but on a much more dramatic scale with hundreds of people. And at one point, all of the horses and riders came towards the stands where we were, and they were crashing, and the horses around us, and cars being plummeted. And there was a deputy prime minister, a lady, clinging to a pillar as this was going, and she screamed over to me, "This is what they think is democracy!"
Last question. And that is, what do you think is going to happen when the United States sends a relatively clear signal that we may withdraw sooner rather than later? How do you feel that those groups, whether it's Taliban, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's other power brokers, will react when they begin farming out the signal? Because there is this old Afghan saying, you may have the watches,
but we have the time.
time.
Well, I think that if any planned withdrawal, just as it's a very bad idea, in my view, to keep saying that we want to talk to the Taliban, announcing it without happening. I don't think would be a good idea to announce a calendar for the withdrawal of the forces, because it would inevitably lead not only the Taliban to have hopes, but it would lead to all kinds of other of neighbors planning what to do when this moment came. And indeed, it would encourage, for example, those in Pakistan who believe that the U.S. and the West will leave Afghanistan, and who want to ensure that a friendly government is established in Kabul.
Well, unfortunately, if you analyze the media, that's already what they say.
But of course, the public, the Western public, will demand, as they've done with Iraq, they will demand some kind of exit strategy.
Let's hope for that. Thank you very much.